Good morning and welcome to the second class of forces. And hopefully you were able to get through that in-home lab that kind of introduced you to some forces. So today we're going to talk about those. So we're going to talk about forces and get into Newton's laws. We're going to look at the first law today, and we'll do the second and third law in the next couple days. So first thing is first, what is force? Force is any interaction between two objects that causes a push or a pull. So specifically, there's two things. That has to be two objects. Two objects have to be involved, and only two. If there's only one, you can't have a force. And if there's more than two objects, then there's going to be more than one force. And it's anything that causes a push or a pull between the two objects. And in general, we look at two types of forces. We look at contact forces. These are forces that are caused by two objects that physically come in contact with each other. So they are physically pushing on each other or physically pulling on each other. The other one is what we call field forces. These are forces that are caused between two objects that act at a distance. So these would be things that act on each other but from a distance. We'll get into some of these, but this would be like gravity. You know, you jump off of something, you fall to the ground. There's not something physical pulling you down, but it's that force of gravity, that attraction that's pulling you down. Magnets, if you can hold magnets away from each other, but they want to pull each other or push each other away from each other. So those would be field forces. So in the lab that you did a whole bunch of different types of forces. So I'm just going to go through these and hopefully make them make sense. And as usual, feel free to pause this if you need to, take time to write these things down. So the first one is force of gravity, which is also weight. I think next class we're going to get more into this. Force of gravity and weight are the same thing. It's the gravitational pull from Earth or any other planetary object. So it's pulling you down. Now, technically, everything has a force of gravity, but we really only worry about force of gravity when we talk about planets like Earth or other planets. All right, the second one is called a normal force. Normal force, one way you can remember is it's normally there. It's a perpendicular supporting force that pushes from any surface touching an object. So the floor, when you're standing on the floor is pushing up on you and keeping you from falling down. Your chair, when you sit in a chair, the chair is pushing up on you to make sure you don't fall and hit the floor. If you're leaning against the wall, then the wall is supporting you. The wall is pushing back on you to make sure you don't fall, fall down. Next one is the force of friction. So the force of friction is any two objects that try to slide or rub against each other. So there's a key there. It says that they try to. So if you push your hands together, you try and push them apart and they don't quite move. If you're trying to slide them from each other and they don't quite move with each other, there's still friction there. That's what's keeping them from sliding. And obviously if you do rub them, hands are gonna warm up because they're pushing on each other. It's a pushing force that's parallel to the surface and in the opposite direction of the slide. So if this is my surface and I'm sliding across it, whichever way my object is sliding, that friction force is going to go the opposite direction that I'm sliding. All right, next one is what we kind of call applied force. And applied force is kind of like a catch-all. It's basically for any outside external force on object. Often it's used for when there's human interaction. So if a human is pushing on a block or pulling on a rope, we call that the applied force. All right, next one is the force of tension. Force of tension is when there's any kind of rope, string, cable, cord, chain, whatever, that pulls on an object. It's going to pull in the direction of the rope. So if you've got a block and it's going off at an angle, the force is going to go off at that exact same angle. And so we call that force of tension. All right, Next one is spring force. Any object that can be stretched or compressed and tries to return to its original shape. So there's two parts of this. It's first of all, anything that can be stretched or compressed, but the second part of this is just as important, and it tries to return to its original shape. So something like Play-Doh or silly putty would not count, because if you stretch out Play-Doh, it just stays there. It doesn't try and like spring back to its original shape. But things like a slinky or a spring, rubber bands, balloons, bouncy balls, all those things, if you stretch them or compress them, they always want to return back to their original shape. So those would be things that have spring force. All right. Our next one is air resistance. Air resistance is the resistance of air pushing on a moving object. Now, technically, there is air resistance in anything moving. But we really only worry about it, it's really only significant for really large or really fast moving objects, or if it's important to the situation. So something like a parachute, air resistance is pretty important. If you're falling down, you want that parachute to hold you up. Airplane's gonna have a lot of air resistance. Air resistance is what's lifting that airplane, keeping that airplane up. A skydiver, as they fall, is going to feel a lot of that air resistance on their body as they fall. We got two more. Next one is magnetic force, the attraction, which is when things pull together, or the repulsion of pushing away due to a magnetic field. Best example, magnets. So if you've never played with magnets, go get some and play with them. Magnets are a lot of fun to play with. You know, if you flip them the same sides and you kind of push them together, you can feel that magnetic field pushing against you. And if you flip them back around so the sides are opposite, they want to snap together, and you can kind of hold them and you can feel that pull as they try and pull each other together. All right, the last one is electrostatic forces. This is the attraction again, or the repulsion, due to a difference in electrical charge. So if you've ever stuffed your feet across the carpet and then gone up and shocked somebody, or just simply tried to, open a door and gotten shocked, that static electricity, actually, there's a force in there, and you can actually kind of feel it. It kind of pushes away at you. This is the whole principle behind lightning. As the two different clouds come together, their static electricity is different, and they push together and they get a charge built up, and it discharges into the earth. So that would be electrostatic force. So we're going to talk about Newton's three laws. So just to give you a little background on Newton, he was an English mathematician, he was a physicist, astronomer, theologian, and author. Interesting fact, he created calculus during the plague at his time. They had a very similar stay-at-home order, and it was while he was at home by himself that he developed calculus. He also established the three laws of motion and the universal law of gravitation. We won't get into the universal law of gravitation in this class, but if you take any other physics class after, you'll get into that. All right, so I got a couple demonstrations for you. So the first one is about eggs, whether they're hard-boiled or soft.
All right, I've got 2 eggs. One of them's hard-boiled, one of them's not cooked at all. So how can you tell the difference between the two? Well, we're going to use inertia. So I'm going to do a little demonstration for you. So I'm going to take both eggs, I'm going to stand them on an egg, and I'm going to spin them. And let's see what they do. So this one. Spins fairly nicely. All right, I'm going to do the same thing with this one. Oh, that one just quit on me. Let's try again. In fact, I'm going to mix them up. I'm going to mix them up. I don't know which one's which. There are 2 white eggs. I have no idea which one's which. So we'll try it again. That one doesn't want to spin. Ooh, that one spins really nice. Let's try this one again. Still doesn't want to spin. So I've got one egg that spins really nicely and one egg that doesn't. Why? Well, because this egg, the egg that doesn't spin, has a yolk inside that sloshes around. It is unstable, as opposed to the egg that's cooked is solid inside. So it's going to spin really, really nicely. So that's inertia. Object at motion wants to stay in motion. Oops. Wants to stay in motion. This object at rest, the yolk inside, wants to stay at rest, and it just wants to not spin.
All right, next one is egg in a glass. All right, this is a former student of mine, Drew, and this is a demonstration we would have done in class, but he's going to demonstrate it for us via video in slow motion. So as he hits the pie pan, the egg drops straight down, the pie pan go flying, and the egg flops straight down. So what this is doing is this is showing that the egg wants to stay in its spot. The egg wants to stay where it is, but the force is being applied horizontally to the pie pan, so it goes flying out of the way. The egg, once the holder is removed, it falls straight down. All right, so the next one I want to share with you is a car crash video, and this is a really good video to remind you to wear your seatbelts. This is an older video, so notice that the driver just slides right up his seat. Watch him slide right up the seat. The car comes to a stop, but his body wants to keep moving. His body moves right up into it. Gets a whole face full of windshield. And then the next one is wearing a seatbelt and an airbag. So he crashes, and he still moves forward, but with not as much damage to his body. And there's a side-by-side comparison of the two. Again, like I said, just watch the top one, just watch his backside slide right up that chair and then hit the windshield. So please wear your seatbelts. So these demonstrations lead us into Newton's first law of motion. Newton's first law of motion states that an object at rest wants to stay at rest, and an object in motion wants to stay in motion unless acted on by an outside unbalanced force. And this is one of those laws that when he first wrote it had a lot of arguments and people didn't agree with it. The biggest thing was that, in the normal course of events, everything wants to stop, right? You roll something across the floor, it might roll for a while, but it eventually stops. You slide something, it stops. Well, the idea is because there's unbalanced outside force, friction, which slows it down. So his theory was that if there was no friction, it would move on forever. And this is often called the law of inertia. Inertia is the tendency of an object to resist any change in motion. So it's basically a restating of Newton's law. An object wants to keep doing whatever it's doing. If it's in motion, it wants to stay in motion. If it's stopping, it wants to stop. And the key to inertia is it's all about the mass. When we talk about inertia, it's simply the mass of the object. It doesn't matter how fast it's going, doesn't matter how slow it's going, doesn't matter where it's at. All it matters is the mass of the object. So something with more mass will have more inertia. Something with less mass will have less inertia. All right, so your homework for today is a worksheet on the types of forces, and you can find that in the classwork section.